Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the year 1968. And 1968 in American history was a really crazy time because we did have a lot of military issues because we're still stuck in the war in Vietnam. We have political turmoil at home, especially within the Democratic Party. And then you do have massive civil rights impacts that we'll talk about. And as we kind of go through this lecture, I do want you to keep one question in mind. And the concept question for this lecture is, how did the events of 1968 affect national political life? In terms of the Vietnam War, the thing that did affect the United States the most was the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive was an attack by the North Vietnamese during the lunar truce of Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year. And for weeks, the North had been sending soldiers into the South who were disguised as Tet celebrants and tourists. And at the same time, they were smuggling weapons in trucks that were filled with produce and had the weapons smuggled underneath, and then also in coffins and fake funeral processions. And so realistically, what they had put in place were that the soldiers and the weapons were in place to try and take control of 5 major cities. And the Viet Cong carried out this surprise attack, and it did last for about a month before the United States did gain control of the cities once again. And in this battle of the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong does suffer massive losses, and they do lose over 32,000 troops, and America does only lose over 3,400, which is a drastic difference. But the United States have been constantly telling the citizens that we're winning this war, and it was a war that was coming to an end. And this is realistically kind of showing that the North Vietnamese are still very entrenched in this fight. It's something that still is going to be a long kind of fight for the United States to pull out of, and we widen that credibility gap again. After the Tet Offensive, there was a famous newscaster by the name of Walter Cronkite. And Walter Cronkite very much kind of summarized what a lot of Americans were feeling after the Tet Offensive. And I want you to watch a quick video clip that he gave on the nightly news. And while you watch the clip, I want you to think, how did Walter Cronkite summarize the Tet Offensive and the impact it had on the war coming to an end?
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance that military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victims, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
1968 also brought the tragic death of Dr. Martin Luther King, and King and other SCLC members were called into Memphis, Tennessee to support a sanitation workers' strike. And on the night of April 3rd, Dr. King gave a speech at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis, and in his speech, King really seemed to foreshadow his own untimely passing, or at least to strike a particular reflective note, ending with the words that you're going to see in the video clip to follow.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. So just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really the matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
On April 4th, 1968, James Earl Ray assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King, and the United States had lost the founder of the SCLC, a prominent civil rights activist since the mid-1950s, and this is going to be something that's going to be very, very tragic, not only for Dr. King's family, but also just for the nation as a whole. And after his assassination, riots did go and erupt in a lot of U.S. cities, Baltimore, Chicago, our nation's capital, but one place where it didn't erupt and you didn't have any violence was in Indianapolis, Indiana, and that's because Robert Kennedy was there on the campaign trail, and he gave a very, very impromptu, passionate speech that resonated with a lot of the community. And so as you watch the clip, I want you to keep the following questions in mind. First, how does this clip showcase some of the traits that would have made Robert Kennedy a good presidential candidate? And then second, how does Kennedy use his own personal tragedy to try and keep the peace in Indianapolis?
Do they know about Martin Luther King? Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times, A favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And want to dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy was also assassinated, and he was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, who was upset over the United States' stance on the Arab-Israeli conflict and us siding with Israel. And this seemed that in the 1960s that there was a trend that was developing with the assassination of a lot of key leaders, from the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and also Medgar Evers in 1963, the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King in 1968, and now Robert Kennedy in 1968. It does seem that violence is starting to become like a trend in the United States, and liberals especially have lost a lot of key leaders. And this happened during a Democratic primary year and a presidential election year. And Robert Kennedy was running for presidency of the United States. And this is because LBJ decided to not run for a second term, even though he could have, because he had lost so much support over the Vietnam War. And so most people thought that this was going to be a square off between Kennedy and McCarthy. But when Kennedy was assassinated, this does kind of elevate the vice president at the time, Hubert Humphrey, and the Democratic primary becomes a square off between Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy. Eventually, in 1968, you had the Democratic National Convention, where the Democrats were going to select their candidate to run for president of the United States. And at that time, you had a bunch of anti-war protesters that ended up crashing the city and ended up ultimately clashing in police in what many call the Siege of Chicago. And a lot of these protesters were extremely upset with the fact that Hubert Humphrey had won the primary, because they really saw Hubert Humphrey as being an extension of the Johnson administration, and they were really upset with Johnson's current kind of position with the Vietnam War. Mayor Daley's going to really organize his police force in what's going to very much be organized police brutality in lots of ways, and I'm going to let you kind of see it more on a video clip here in a minute. And when you do watch the video clip, I want you to think about a couple questions. First, how did the 1968 Democratic National Convention hurt the Democratic Party for the upcoming election? And second, how was the 1968 Democratic Convention a manifestation of the political struggles America had undergone up until this point of the 1960s?
The Democratic Party, the majority party. It was so simple, or seemed that way. There were more Democrats than Republicans, therefore, there were more Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. It was so for years, until 1968, and only one since then. It is is possible the Democratic Party has never recovered from what happened in 1968. It is possible. To understand the party now, you have to see it then. The Democrats were in power, but the country was in trouble over the war in Vietnam, and so the party was in trouble. Correspondent John Hart reports from Chicago, where in 1968, the Democrats held a convention.
In the week before the convention, 300 Americans were killed in Vietnam, a typical week that year. In the 4 months before, Robert Kennedy was murdered. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. 125 cities had riots, including this one, where the mayor scolded his police for going too easy. Many young people were saying the system didn't work, and when 10,000 of them came here to demonstrate that, and some of them put a Vietnamese communist flag on the statue of a Civil War hero, the mayor's police did not go easy. A federal investigation later concluded there had been provocations from the demonstrators, rocks, bottles, and other things thrown at police, but that the response was, in the words of the report, unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence. It was as if the normal restraints on human behavior, having been lifted in Vietnam, were slipping dangerously in this country as well. The violence of the war which divided the country was echoed by violence in the streets which divided the country further. Anti-war delegates were harassed on the floor.
What are you trying to strong-arm stuff? He's an elected delegate.
This is John Chancellor on the floor. I'm looking down at Edwin Newman in the middle of a huge bunch of security people. How did it get started? Do you know?
They keep coming around all day, checking our credentials. And it's time they stop. There is nothing in the rules of the Democratic Party that says they have a right to check us every 10 minutes. They have harassed us an entire day.
The Chicago police are now in the aisles here with billy clubs, clearing people out. They're not using them on people, they're carrying them, and they're dragging everybody right out of the aisle here. It's a terrific crush. About 6 policemen came in here, some of them wearing the blue helmets of the Chicago police force, and they are dragging out of here the people who were involved in this. One delegate from New York who objected to having his credentials checked.
This surely is the first time that policemen have ever entered a convention, the floor of a convention.
In the United States.
Right.
Colorado. Mr. Chairman, Colorado rises to a point of information. Is there any rule under which Mayor Daley can be compelled to suspend the police state terror perpetrated this minute on kids in front of the Conrad Hilton?
By the night of the presidential nominations, the National Guard backed up the police to keep streets clear of demonstrators. The guards used tear gas, but the police used nightsticks.
President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
What are we coming to as a society? What are we coming to as a country? If policemen are treated the way they have been treated, not only in Chicago, but all over the country, on the grounds that the confrontation has to be made because we got to get the action. We got to get the violence.
It would have been impossible to hold the Democratic National Convention in any city in the United States or throughout the world without demonstrations or disruption. Daley's right on this point. Chicago just happened to be the city. It would have been impossible to hold it anywhere because the Democratic Party has blood on its hands.
By the time Vice President Humphrey won the nomination, it was a broken prize, which his co-chairman Walter Mondale could only try to restore.
The vice president was a candidate along with the rest. We were dealt with the same as they were, and we won, I think, in a convention which is as fair as any's ever been.
The establishment kept its power and lost the election. The outsiders were left with symbolic gestures, nominating a young black from Georgia for vice president, Julian Bond, who had become a symbol of the rebellion.
Fellow delegates, the people of America are watching us now.
as indeed the whole world is watching us.
1968 was a struggle between the ins and the outs left Chicago determined to take power. They did, and some of those who were bloodied in the streets then are delegates in San Francisco now. The outsiders of...
So one of the people that you got to see at the end of that clip was Jerry Rubin. And Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman together had started a political movement that they called the Youth International Party, or otherwise known as the Yippies. And the Yippies were really known at kind of having stunts that were tried to get massive media exposure. And one of the things that they did during the 1968 National Convention is they decided to mock the convention by electing a pig who they called Pegasus as their presidential candidate. And they did try to get the pig elected, and ultimately the cops' brutality in Chicago also ended up getting Pegasus arrested as kind of part of that as well. Ultimately, as the Democratic Party started to get kind of portrayed in the media as being a joke of the 1968 election, this did make it so that the Republican Party did nominate Richard Nixon, who very much ran under the slogan of reestablishing law and order in the United States. And during this election, you also had a third-party candidate, George Wallace, who ran under the independent party ticket. And George Wallace was actually able to take 5 southern states, the Deep South basically, and the segregationalist South. And remember that we're talking about the same George Wallace that stood up and wanted to protest the Selma March and stop the Selma March from happening with Dr. King. In terms of the popular vote for this election, it was very, very close, as you can kind of see on the numbers of the chart that I have here portrayed. But in terms of the electoral votes, it was definitely a solid win for Nixon and the Republican Party. And this does lead you to Nixon's first term in office in 1968, and he will actually get reelected later as well. So now that we've hit the end of the lecture, go back and answer the concept question. How did the events of 1968 affect national political life in the United States?